I'm Stanley Rabinowitz, the director of the Amherst Center for Russian Culture. Corey Flintoff has been to the Russian Center. I think we were saying it about 6 years ago. He came with his very good friend Jim Kelly, who is the Slavic bibliographer for the Center and for Amherst College. He's had a bit of a tour, but it doesn't surprise me at all that a journalist at the end of his beat in Moscow would want to come back to the Center for Russian Culture in Amherst, Massachusetts, because the center was founded by Thomas Whitney, class of 1937, at the end of his beat as a journalist in Moscow, not directly at the end, but some years later. Tom was the class of 1937. He was summoned to, invited to Moscow in 1944 during World War II. He worked at the embassy as a diplomat. Those were, of course, exciting days. Harriman, Salisbury, Kennan, these were important people, and he married a Russian woman who was not allowed to leave the country. And so Tom stayed from 1946 through 1953 as the Associated Press's correspondent in Moscow, where for 8 years he was writing dispatches on Russia. He left in 1953 in July after Stalin died. Tom was allowed to take his Russian wife back to the United States. Tom came back to New York. He kept working for the Associated Press. He was a journalist really all of his life. And he was a stringer for the Associated Press right through the 60s. He was president of the Overseas Press Club from 1958 to 1959. In 1962, he wrote a wonderful book called Russia in My Life, which recounts his years in Russia, mostly as a journalist. And then in 62, in the mid-60s, he started collecting books, rare books, manuscripts, and art, which became, in 1991, the foundation of the Center for Russian Culture, which I hope you will get a chance to see. We will open the gallery as well. I think that Russia was the intellectual and emotional locus of Tom's life until he died, although he gave up journalism in the 80s to become a translator. My hope is that perhaps Corey will come back to a place which clearly loves him very much, and that is Amherst, Massachusetts. He could do worse than not only read Tom's book about being a journalist in Russia, but also possibly reading it and writing his own memoir called Russia in My Life, and maybe even doing a comparative study of what it was like to be a journalist in the late Stalin period and what it is in the, who knows, mid-late Putin period. So hope springs eternal that this will happen, but before it happens, Corey will be here to talk to us, and Martin Miller will introduce the rest of the evening for you. I hope to see you at the Russian Center. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming inside on this climate change day. Thank you, Stanley, for your welcome. New England Public Radio is proud to be co-host this afternoon with Amherst College and the Russian Department, and we look forward to seeing you at the reception afterwards. I hope you're all aware of our expanded partnership with Amherst College on WAMH 89.3 FM. In addition to student programming, you can now hear the NPR News Network. And we've started to offer a digital media course workshop for Amherst College students, which happens in our newly renovated facility at UMass. And Corey will be with us tomorrow to dedicate that. So we're very proud of that new partnership with Amherst College. I'm very pleased to introduce this afternoon's speakers. Boris Wilson is a scholar of 20th century Russian cultural history with a special interest in theater and performance. At Amherst, where he has been since 2008, he teaches a wide range of books and films, from Tolstoy's War and Peace to Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible and beyond. Now, I'm really glad to have heard Stanley's story of the connection with Amherst College, with journalism, because I think it was kind of fortuitous that the stars aligned to get Corey here for these 2 days. My wife and I and our family have an interest in Russia because in 2000, we went to the Kaliningrad region where we adopted our daughter from an orphanage. And she's now 18 in college. But this summer, we traveled with her and our son on a trip with other families who were bringing their children back to Russia to see where they came from. And because Corey's been here so many times and he has kind of adopted WFCR as his home away from home, I guess, I've gotten to know him through those years, and I emailed him and said, we're going to be in Moscow. Do you want to get together for dinner? And he said, well, I'm going to Crimea to do a story, and you may hear something about Crimea this afternoon, so I'm not going to be able to do it. So I said, okay, we'll try to get together another time. So on the final Sunday we were in Moscow, we were taken to a large outdoor marketplace with many people and a lot of kiosks. And we were looking at some of the kiosks, and I had my back turned, and all of a sudden I hear, Martin? And my wife says, Corey Flintoff? And they'd come back early, and were in the market that day. So I think the stars aligned for him to be here today. After joining NPR in 1990, Corey worked for many years as a newscaster during All Things Considered. In 2005, he became part of the NPR team covering the Iraq War, where he embedded with U.S. military units fighting insurgents and hunting roadside bombs. For the last 4 years, until September, Corey Flintoff was NPR's international correspondent based in Moscow. His journalism career has taken him to more than 50 countries, most recently to cover the civil war in Libya, the revolution in Egypt, and the war in Afghanistan. Please welcome Corey Flintoff and Boris Wolfson.
Thank you for coming. Of course. First of all, let's just make sure that everyone can hear us. Yep, good. I'm not Corey. I'm the other one. And even though some of us spent last week atoning, I have a confession to make today, which is that I had heard Corey on radio for many years, but it wasn't until one memorable Sunday when I finally remembered the name, and that was the Sunday that Corey was on Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, where he has been a guest on several occasions, but has also substituted for Carl Castle as the voice of God. So I want to start with a little homage to Wait, Wait. They have a game called Bluff the Listener. Those of you who haven't heard the show, the way it works is a contestant who calls in hears 3 different stories. They are all unlikely stories, and one of them happens to be true. The goal is to guess which unlikely story is the true one. I think it's the hardest game. And yeah. So here's your chance to tell us a story about Russia that would qualify for Bluff the Listener. You were there during the years when things went from complicated to extraordinarily complicated in a matter of minutes. But I wonder if there is a story that seemed so improbable when it was happening that really struck you that you could use it on Bluff the Listener.
Okay, good. Okay, so the story that sounds plausible, but is probably not true. Let's be ready for this. Okay, there's a group of young men, young entrepreneurs in Moscow, and all of them, of course, have relatives out in the countryside in the Moscow region. And one of them comes back from visiting his relatives in the countryside, and he says, you know, my auntie's health clinic in her village has no beds. So, you know, I think what we should do is hire a van and buy a couple of beds and take them out there. And while we're out there, we'll take some tools and we'll take a little paint and we'll clean up this clinic and paint it up and put the beds in, and then we'll go out and get drunk. And so that's what they do. They go out there and they help resuscitate this health clinic in the village. And it proves to be so successful that they gather together a few more guys and they do it in the health clinic in the next village. So now they've got 6 or 8 guys, you know, who'll show up on a fairly regular basis on these little excursions, and they'll fix up these health clinics. And the people in the villages are, of course, really happy with what's happening. Immediately, the authorities crack down on them and tell them that, you know, if they continue this kind of thing, they're going to be arrested. Why? Well, because you're doing something that should be a government function. And, you know, you're usurping the authority of the government. Plus, you're making the government look bad because it makes us look corrupt, because the money that we should have spent on beds somehow disappeared into our dachas. You know, and finally, any act of leadership or volunteerism is something that's a threat to the existing order, and therefore we can't let you do it. True? Not true. Oh, you're a cynical bunch.
I hear true.
It's true. And we're the reason I happen to tell the story, in fact, my wife Diana, the lady with the purple hair over there, was reminding me about this story because we were talking about civic engagement. And you know, one of the things that's wonderful about living in the United States is that no matter what our government and whatever our political officials happen to do, there is always the option for civic engagement, and people can work together and accomplish great things for charity and for mutual benefit without fearing that somehow the government is going to crack down on them. That's something that people in Russia today have to worry about. And it's a sad thing because there's a great spirit of cooperation and civic engagement in Russia that just never gets an opportunity to show itself.
So picking up on the unbelievable and I guess on American civic institutions, one of the things that's been hard for many of us to believe, especially those of us who work on Russia, is the way in which the tensions surrounding Russia have ramped up over the last few hours, last few minutes. It seems like every few seconds there's some new revelation and the temperature seems to rise. You arrived in 2012 at a relatively hopeful time and have watched this situation become tenser and tenser. And I wonder, maybe we could start by playing one of the stories and showing one of these moments when things seemed to become particularly tense.
Yes,
first.
absolutely.
Let's do
it's a kind of a pivotal moment. We'll play this story for you, which is just as a reminder, it is about the shoot down of the Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 over eastern Ukraine in 2014. I happened to be there immediately after the plane went down. And this is a setup for the situation that took place when the world finally was discovering that 300 innocent people had died in this explosion or this shoot down. And all of a sudden, a lot of conflicting narratives came up almost within hours after the event took place.
Secretary of State John Kerry spent a lot of time on TV yesterday laying out what he says is extraordinary circumstantial evidence that rebels in eastern Ukraine shot down the Malaysia Airlines jetliner. Kerry said on NBC's Meet the Press they did it with Russian help.
It is clear that Russia supports the separatists, supplies the separatists, encourages the separatists, trains the separatists, And Russia needs to step up and make a difference here.
Now, at the crash site in eastern Ukraine, international observers are trying to keep tabs on the rebels' treatment of victims' bodies and potential evidence. NPR's Corey Flintoff reports from Donetsk.
At one of the main debris sites, local search and rescue men in blue overalls stoop over the blackened ground, lifting barely recognizable objects from the wreckage and placing them in body bags. The rebels control this area, and a pair of them stand guard nearby. The supervisor of the search team from Donetsk won't give his name because he's not supposed to speak to reporters.
Я не готов вам сказать за утро, мы только тут начали, поэтому.
They just started. He's not sure how many bodies exactly belong to persons, but here's the bags, and that's what they found.
What he means, the translator explains, is that searchers can't be sure which parts belong to which bodies. And what do the smaller bags contain? Fragments, he says. Fragments. This portion of the plane came down in a farmer's field on the edge of a village, and some of the villagers look on from across the road. Nadezhda is a pensioner who's lived nearly 70 years in the village. She didn't want to give her full name because she fears there might be repercussions from one side or the other. She says she was sitting on a bench with neighbors when the wreckage crashed from the sky.
And they saw something big from the sky start to falling up. Was on the left, on the right, on the left, on the right, and like crashed on the ground. Now they've seen the fires, some pieces.
Nadezhda says that some men from the village went out to see what happened and reported that there were bodies everywhere. She didn't go to look then, but she seems compelled to watch from a distance now. Around midday, some members of the observer team from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe arrived to examine the crash site. They've been trying to see more of this area for the past 2 days, but said that rebels limited their movements. This time, they seem to have unhindered access. Later, leaders of the team said that rebels had removed most of the bagged bodies and moved them to a town not far from the crash site. Michael Bachorkiu, the spokesman for the team, said they went to that town and were granted access to 3 refrigerated railway cars where the body bags are being stored.
Now, the body bags were tagged with a numbering system. We were not able to count the body bags, and it's important to point out that entering and handling the body bags would require special protective equipment.
At a news conference earlier in the day, rebel leader Alexander Baradai confirmed that the bodies had been removed and said they would remain where they are until international experts come to examine them. He also said that rebels have control of some items believed to be the voice and data recorders from the plane. The treatment of the bodies stirred outrage in the Netherlands, which was home to many of the passengers. The Netherlands Prime Minister demanded that the remains be transferred to Ukrainian government control as soon as possible. The next step will be to figure out how to work with the rebels to ensure safety for the experts who'll be coming to examine the crash site. Meanwhile, scores of bodies have not been found, and their fate remains unknown. Corey Flintoff, NPR News, Donetsk.
You know, the reason that I chose that particular grim story, I mean, it's obviously old news. Everybody knows pretty much what happened after that. But it seems to be, to me, to be sort of symbolic of a lot of different threads that come together in relations between Russia and at least the Western world. One is the difficulty of reporting on events that involve Russia. Another is the kinds of conflicting narratives that the Russian government itself promulgates whenever something like this happens. In this particular case, you may recall Russian officials put forth 4 or 5 different narratives about what might have happened in this case, ranging from absolute science fiction. And there was, in fact, a claim that a dummy plane, had been loaded with dead bodies in the Netherlands, flown over eastern Ukraine, and blown up as a way to make the separatists and the Russians there look bad. This was something that actually had some currency in the early days after this happened. The sort of most pervasive narrative came from the Russian Defense Ministry, which said that the plane was shot down by a Ukrainian fighter jet. And as evidence, they offered a satellite photograph that showed the pathway of MH17 as it passed over this part of Ukraine. And it showed, or purported to show, a small image of a Ukrainian fighter jet in the corner of the photograph. So it seemed like pretty convincing evidence that the Ukrainians had done this. Well, a citizen journalist group called Bellingcat, that's based in the UK, within a matter of a few days, searched through all the satellite photographs that had been taken of this area over the previous couple of weeks. And what they found was a photograph that exactly matched the cloud formations that were shown in the photograph that was offered by the Russian Defense Ministry. Exactly, to the pattern repeated perfectly, which demonstrated that the photograph that the Russians were using had been taken long before the incident actually happened. They also pointed out that this tiny image of the Ukrainian jet was a Photoshop. But by the time that had happened, the Defense Ministry's narrative had gotten out there and was widely spread in domestic Russian media, in Russia's state-run media. And so that was the narrative that stuck. And I would bet you that if you asked a lot of viewers out in the provinces what happened that day, that's what they would still tell you today. This is back in the news again, incidentally, because just last month, the Dutch Safety Board released its report and actually said quite definitively and quite persuasively that this plane was shot down by a Russian anti-aircraft missile called a Buk that was brought across the Ukrainian border, parked in rebel-controlled area, and then removed shortly after the shoot-down took place. So it follows a kind of a familiar pattern. Conflicting narratives, repeated denials, claims that anything that foreign investigators put forward is really not anti-regime, but anti-Russian.
So one of the reasons the story, I like the idea of beginning with the story is both because it's back on the news and because it shows the high stakes of everyday life. What you're reporting on are the minute details, but the stakes are actually very high. Several governments are involved, right? We have this lead-in from America's top diplomat. You conclude with a reference to the actions of another government. And so it feels like the stakes of what you're reporting on are very high, even though what you're doing is going body part by body part. Having worked in so many places where life is constantly in danger and the safety of those who you're interviewing and your own safety is a primary concern, I wonder how you would describe the differences between reporting on events in Russia, the kind of the high stakes of Russian reporting by comparison with reporting on a war, on an ongoing revolution. What makes the Russian stories, what builds the high stakes of a Russian story for you?
I would have to say that, and I think I'm speaking to an audience of people who have special interest in Russia and the former Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. I would say that for foreign reporters, reporting on that area is probably easier and safer than the reporting that I did, say, for instance, in Iraq or Afghanistan or Haiti, for that matter. There's an actual possibility that you could get in the wrong place at the wrong time. But in Russia, especially if you're reporting for a foreign news organization, there's a lot less interest on the part of the government in what you have to say. I mean, NPR is broadcast primarily in the United States, although it is available on the internet throughout the world. It has very little carriage in Russia and very little readership on the Russian internet. The Russian authorities have no particular interest in what I do and no particular worry that I'm going to cause them a great deal of difficulty. Now, if I'm a Russian reporter in trying to do exactly the same thing, then I'm in quite considerable jeopardy. And as we've seen, quite a number of my Russian colleagues have been killed, savagely beaten, imprisoned, repressed in multiple ways.
I wonder if you could talk about the relationship between Russian reporters and non-Russian reporters as these stories get covered. On a daily basis, what is that interaction like? How has the situation shifted over the years for the Russian reporters? And how do you know whom to trust when you talk to a member of your profession who happens to be a Russian reporter?
There's a big division between people who work for the state-run media in Russia and people who work for opposition or at least independent media. People who work for state-run media over the course of the last 4 years have become sort of increasingly separate from foreign reporters. I've been on reporting trips with Russian media crews, state-run media, who wouldn't speak a word to me. They regard us as the kind of people who are there to make Russia look bad, where they see themselves as being there to produce a counter-narrative to anything that we might report. And so we have very little to talk about, actually. And sometimes those interactions would get to be a little bit testy, even. When I'm dealing with reporters who work for independent media, say in Russia or in Ukraine, then the relationship ranges from at least sort of mutually cooperative to at least cordial. So, and this is reflected in the attitude of state-run broadcasters who say, this is a sign that those independent and opposition Russian reporters are traitors, essentially. They've gone over to the West and they fraternize with Western media who are there to make us look bad.
So you're picking up on kind of a major narrative that has been gaining strength over the past several years, that by engaging with Western culture, you're somehow not being loyal to the true Russian essence of what you do. One of the ways in which we've seen this play out is in the law that demands that non-governmental organizations declare themselves to be foreign agents if they receive grants from foreign organizations and thereby become suspect. I wonder if you could describe, for all of our benefit, other kind of ideological strains that have emerged over the last few years, other narratives. So one narrative is you're a foreign agent working against us. You're the fifth column. Other things that you see appear in the state-run press or in the society that seem to be picking up steam?
It's hard to say. We were talking a little bit earlier about, what is the sort of ideological basis for, the Kremlin narrative. And the odd thing about it is that it has changed or changes repeatedly. And it seems to be very difficult for the Kremlin to kind of pin down an ideological basis for their authority. On the one hand, at sometimes it's conservative values as expressed through the Russian Orthodox Church. At other times, it's a kind of return to the glory days at the end of the Great Patriotic War, when Russians saw themselves as the victors in Europe after making enormous sacrifices, and tells people that we need to make the same kind of sacrifice because we're now a besieged society surrounded by NATO, surrounded by both economic and military enemies, and we have to be ready to face them just as our grandparents faced the Nazis during World War II. Those are some of the kinds of things that come up periodically, almost in rotation.
How do you think that plays out for different generations? As you encounter people for different stories, do you feel that there are generational divides? Are the divides along social lines? What are the fault lines in the social fabric?
I think it's less along generational lines. Where this occurs, I guess, is in younger people. Younger people, I think, tend to be more influenced by the sort of general narrative that comes out in the state-run media. And so, for instance, that narrative about the great victory in the Patriotic War and what it says about the Russian character and what it says about us as a government and the way we all work together is almost more persuasive with younger people who encounter this narrative, at an earlier age. For instance, and we see this has been presented, for instance, on the 70th anniversary of the victory in World War II. It was played up in a way that it had not been played up in decades. The military parades were over the top, and the wearing of the St. George's ribbon as an expression of your patriotism was over the top. And young people tended to remember this as, a glorious victory that was absolutely unblemished by casualties, unblemished by repression from the government, unblemished by the Soviet Union's relations with Hitler before the war. All this is forgotten. But now older people who were there tend to remember this much more. They remember a much more nuanced situation both during and after the war. And they're the ones who tend to be less complete believers.
You mentioned that you arrived in Moscow as the protests of 2011, 2012 were still going on but began to wind down. These protests were caused by what was perceived to be a particularly cynical announcement by Putin, who was then prime minister, and Medvedev, who was then president, that they were going to switch roles after the 2012 elections, which was in itself an extraordinary event. People were actually protesting hypocrisy and dishonesty. 4.5 years later, there doesn't seem to be any sense that anything that might happen in Russian politics would bring those people out. You've been there all this time. How would you explain this change?
I'd say that, when I first arrived there in the winter of 2012, the big protests were still going on, and tens of thousands of people were still turning out in very bitter winter weather to express their protest against the government, and not only against the decision for Medvedev and Putin to change places, but against this also very cynical parliamentary election that had taken place earlier in that fall. And there was a lot of optimism on people's part that somehow these protests would be valuable and useful and effective in countering this kind of repression. That stopped right after May the 6th, the demonstrations at Bolotnaya, when the police showed that they were willing to crack down in very violent ways, arrest people more or less at random, try them more or less at random, and give them extremely harsh sentences. So that was a message from the regime to people that it doesn't matter who you are. You might be a top opposition leader. You might be a top academician. You might be, a masseur or a sports trainer or something like that. You could be singled out and sentenced to 4 to 6 years in prison for even taking part in this on evidence that was clearly either fabricated or so flimsy that a court in this country would not have ever prosecuted on it.
So at this point, where does the sense of disagreement, I won't necessarily describe it as dissent, but a sense that there is an alternative point of view, are there any sources from which it can reach a broader Russian audience? Is this just a tight circle of revolutionaries, as Lenin liked to say about the Decembrists, who are sitting in their Moscow apartments and compulsively posting on Facebook every 15 seconds? Or is there some kind of a sense that there is a larger, if not, again, discontent, then a sense of critique that's being offered to the broader population?
I have to say, I think that the repression of the opposition has been so severe and that in severe enough to awaken memories of Stalinist repression, that people are not uniting in the ways that the Decembrists did. There are not networks anymore. There are tremendously fragmented and fractured parts of the Russian opposition, and there are people who have simply just given up. You know, people are trying to live their lives. People are buckling down. People are waiting, you know, for the next presidential election to see what will happen. People are waiting for the outcome of the Syrian war. People are waiting to see whether economic sanctions will be lifted. They're not waiting for opportunities to take part in the political life of the country.
So on the subject of economic sanctions, and I don't mean to over Marx, but there is a sense that when regime change happens in Russia, some kind of economic discontent is always involved. I don't want to suggest any cause and effect connections, but for some observers of Russia, it's been a waiting game of several years. When will the economy finally collapse? And I wonder to what extent you see this reflected in the daily experience of the people you observe. How does the economic reality these days, is there a middle class now that is worried about the future, that has some kind of power? What is the relationship between the large number of people who don't have access to a sustainable source of income and those who do? There have been several recent works of art that have reached the West, Leviathan, the film by Zvekintsev being one of them, in which this problem was put in allegorical and very sharp, one might even say melodramatic terms. Do you see this kind of class warfare being played out in any way in everyday life?
You know, I have to say that you don't see it in places like Moscow and St. Petersburg. You see it a lot more in the provincial cities. But what's happened, I mean, for instance, the root cause of Russia's economic difficulties right now is simply low oil prices and an economy that never made the transition to diversify, you know, to become business friendly, to give an opportunity for people to be entrepreneurial. It's all been based on resource extraction. And of course, you have to remember that Russia is a colossally wealthy country as far as resources are concerned. Even when oil prices are at rock bottom, Russia's oil companies are still making money. They're making even more money today because they're selling their product in dollar-denominated sales, and they're paying for their workforce and their local equipment and their extraction in rubles. And ruble, the value of the ruble has basically fallen by half, meaning that the savings of ordinary people have fallen by half. And people do feel that. You know, this is something that's been very, very hard, especially on pensioners, people on fixed incomes, people in the provinces whose incomes were very low to begin with, people who don't have access to, you know, all the different opportunities to earn more money that exist for people in the big cities. But the interesting thing is that they are not seeing this as the fault of the government. And in some ways, that's the success of the Russian government's propaganda that says, no, this is a result of Western sanctions. It's the pressure that the West is putting us under that's hurting you. And so a lot of that anger is now directed at the West and not at the government that has failed to, you know, provide an economic buffer for these people.
You mentioned that one of the last trips you took when you were in Russia was a foreign ministry-sponsored trip to Crimea. This is a slightly selfish question because it happens to be my homeland. But I wonder if you see any difference in that particular province. A good number of whose residents consider themselves under occupation, and a much larger number of whose residents consider themselves to now be properly Russian. How this both ideological and economic pressure in a region that's under severe economic stress playing itself out? Do you see any difference between that little peninsula and the rest of the country?
Yeah, I do. And I think that, Crimea is feeling the pain because of the loss of its tourism industry. There is virtually no international tourism there. And even though flights are cheap, and Crimea is a legacy destination for Russian vacationers, a place that many people have gone to in childhood that they really loved. And yet, surprisingly, that tourism hasn't picked up. And I think that maybe domestic tourism hasn't picked up because people can't even afford the cost of relatively cheap travel or relatively cheap away from home vacations. So that's a serious problem for people in Crimea. But in other respects, the Russian government is still heavily subsidizing the government in Crimea because, they have to make a success of this, and they have to keep people relatively happy there. And I would say that with the combination of pervasive propaganda and government subsidies, so far they've managed to do it pretty successfully.
So, just as an example, you mentioned that this is a foreign ministry sponsored trip. How much control do you feel when you go on a government-sponsored trip? Do they determine your itinerary? Do they care? You mentioned that they don't particularly care about NPR reporters because they're not talking to Russian citizens. But, the old Soviet paradigm is you're constantly being watched. They want to know where you're going, who you're talking to, etc. I gather that doesn't happen these days. But what sense do you have that a narrative is trying to be kind of created for you to help you see the right way?
Well, I can tell you what the sort of premier items on our itinerary were, and one of the ones that we as foreign reporters really wanted to see was the building of the Kirch Bridge. This is the bridge that will link southern Russia with the Crimean Peninsula. It's an enormous engineering feat, and they're going to accomplish it. They were sort of well on the way when we got there. So there's a great deal of pride in that, a great deal of promoting this as something that showed that, there is the will in Russia, and it's not flagging to make sure that our connection with Crimea becomes stronger and remains stronger. The other thing that we were taken to see was the Black Sea Fleet. And we were taken aboard one of the newest frigates in the Black Sea Fleet. And there's a great deal of money being invested in that, in Russia's presence there, and something that they felt a great deal of pride in. So these are two pride points that were really important to them, and important to make sure that we saw. On the other hand, there was no effort made to prevent us from going in. We were in Simferopol and Sevastopol, and there was no effort made to keep us from talking to people in the street. And we were, in fact, encouraged to do that because they could be relatively certain that the people in those cities were going to say, "You're damn right we support Russia, we're right where we should be." And I'd say that's the attitude of all the Russian heritage people in Crimea right now, or a substantial number. That doesn't speak to the Ukrainians who still remain there, and it doesn't speak to the Crimean Tatars.
So, on the subject of people who matter and who don't, I'd be delighted if I was someone who the Russian government didn't care about. And for a long time, someone like a university professor wasn't. One of the understandings of the social compact of the early 2000s was that the intellectuals, the culture sector did their own thing. As long as they weren't oligarchs trying to run for president, they weren't going to be touched. As long as they didn't enter into the political sphere, they were fairly safe. Around the protests, around 2011, 2012, this began to change. And I wonder, from your perspective, how you see the situation of the arts and intellectual life in Russia today. By all accounts, theaters are full, newspapers are being read still in print, people buy books. I mean, there's all of this evidence that Russia's affection for high culture is still there. But the change in the relationship to the government has become more and more palpable over the years to observers from across the pond. What's your impression of the change from the inside, as it were?
I would say that the cultural scene in Moscow is extremely vibrant. There's as you said, there's a tremendous amount of theater. There's a lot of new productions being mounted, and of course the old repertoire is being performed all over in all kinds of different iterations. But I made some friends in the Russian theater sphere, especially, and people have said to me that and I don't know if this is self-deception or self-censorship, or this is simply artistic license, that artists will talk about and do what they want to do. But people will tell you that, no, we don't feel a great deal of pressure from the government. We don't do political pieces at the moment, but, because we have other concerns. We have other cultural concerns and other societal concerns. There are the people who do theater that could be construed as political are under a great deal of pressure. Theaters have been shut down, usually, for various justifications that have nothing to do with their production. Your theater is closed because it's deemed to be unsafe, or because it needs to be reconstructed, or because your lease has run out and inexplicably the owner of the building wants to use it for a supermarket. So I think on the one hand there's a certain amount of self-censorship going on, and on the other hand the government has shown that when it needs to, it can step in and make sure that it's difficult for you to do the kind of thing that you might want to do.
I think we should probably open it up to questions.
Why did they shoot down the plane?
Sorry?
Why did Russia shoot down that plane?
I think it was a mistake. I think Russia was at that point supporting the separatists, and in fact, in many fronts, the separatists themselves were Russians, and some of them were Russian FSB agents who were fomenting these attempted revolutions in the various towns of the Donbass. I think that the Russians had been supplying weapons, and that they particularly supplied this very sophisticated anti-aircraft system to the rebels, and it is a very sophisticated, technologically difficult weapon to operate that requires a lot of training on the part of the team that operates it. So that would suggest to me that it had to be a Russian team that was doing it. The separatists had some success in shooting down Ukrainian military planes. I believe they shot down about 3 of them over the course of several months of the early stages of the war in eastern Ukraine. I think what happened is that somebody saw this silhouette on their radar and thought that it was a Ukrainian bomber or Ukrainian cargo jet, and shot it down with very little vetting on the part of anybody else on the outside. But I think the reason that the Russians had to deny all this is that to have admitted that this kind of mistake was made would be A, to admit that they were fallible, and B, to admit that in fact there was a Russian military operation going on in eastern Ukraine. And to admit that would have undone the whole process of the way that war had been started. Sir.
Once upon a time during the Cold War, Russia was the center of American attention, and that extended to news offices in Moscow and coverage, placement in newspapers and on the radio. One assumes that fell off after the Cold War. I wonder if you could compare the amount of interest that your bosses, at NPR have now in Russia with what you understand they had before, and not just NPR, but in general, how interested American media are in Russia, and how does that affect your life there as a correspondent?
I would say that when I first got there, American media interest had been in Russia had been flagging for some time. In fact, I have to tell you a dirty little secret, which is that my editors at NPR were thinking about shutting down the NPR bureau just as a cost-saving measure. And this is in 2011, 2012, when things were really starting to take off. That story, the mass demonstrations in Moscow and St. Petersburg, turned that interest around. And so ever afterward, there's been increasing interest on the part of NPR, on the part of the news organizations that still have bureaus and operations, the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal. But nevertheless, a lot of them, the broadcast organizations, have left. The CNN no longer has a permanent presence in Moscow. They bring people in when there's a story to cover. So I would have to say that American media interest has gradually returned, but it still isn't at the level of interest that would justify putting big bureaus in major cities and having people there all the time.
Sure. How about, sir? I have three, actually. I'll try and cram them into a minute. There seems to, you always hear that that Putin has 75% support among the populace of Russia. How much of that do you think is genuine, and how much of that do you think is just an artifact of his crushing control of major media? Second, given that, are we now in a situation where the Russian people and the world's people just have to wait this out and wait for Putin to die to see real change there? And third, I keep hearing about a flurry of preparation for all-out nuclear war in Russia. Is this just a propaganda designed to convince people that somehow the election of Hillary Clinton literally presages the end of the world, or do you think there's something deeper behind it?
Well, as to Putin's popularity, I think it's actually as high as 82%. And that is, in fact, a reflection of the coverage that he gets in Russian media, which is invariably favorable. He's on every single evening news broadcast in some form or the other. And I think that even the way polls are conducted, even by the independent pollster that remains in Russia, are sort of doomed to produce these high numbers, because I don't think people are telling the pollsters the truth when they get the call. You don't know who's calling you up on the phone and asking you how you feel about the Russian government. So there is that. On the issue of, let's see, what was the second question?
Well, do we have to wait for him to die? Is there any prospect of any real change?
I don't see a prospect for any real change. I think that Kremlin control is very strong and very pervasive. It is at both the authoritarian level, but also at the psychological level. And I think, in fact, I think if you ask those 82% of Russian people whether they thought Russia needed a strong leader, they'd say yes. We're at a dangerous and threatening period in our history, and we do need a strong leader, and Putin is our guy. So, yeah, I don't expect him to go away anytime soon, at least not under sort of normal political means. And finally, the preparations for a big nuclear war. I'm hoping, and I think, that Putin and the circle in the Kremlin understands that they cannot win a military confrontation with NATO and the West and the United States. So I think that what they're working on now is a nuclear deterrent that would probably never be unleashed except by accident, which is why these confrontations that occur between Russian and NATO planes are so frightening. But I think in general terms, the buildup of the nuclear deterrent is an attempt to reach what they saw as a level of nuclear deterrent safety that they had during the Soviet times.
Do you think it's related to our elections?
No, I don't. I think it's primarily for domestic purposes.
I wonder whether you could tell us during the years that you were reporting from Moscow, whether you noticed any, dare I say, prejudicial reporting on the part of your colleagues in the media, print or otherwise, a certain tilt, not that facts were not reported correctly, but maybe the emphasis on facts or what was reported maybe was tilted a little too much. I'm thinking of my own reaction to the American media's reporting of the Sochi Olympics before they actually took place. I really did notice, I think Stephen Cohn has talked about this in another issue, a bias, a real bias. Not that this was not true. There was an emphasis on the fact that the bathrooms wouldn't be ready and the living quarters would not be up to snuff. I heard this before the Rio Olympics. That is, I'm concerned that the media, consciously or not consciously, explicitly or not, may be emphasizing certain things that are annoying to the Russians, and that's fine. But I'm just wondering whether you yourself ever came across a report, a dispatch, whatever, that you felt might be either misrepresenting or not properly emphasizing what probably should have been emphasized.
Yeah, I can think of instances of what are probably Western media piling on. But as you said, and about Sochi, it doesn't mean that those stories are not true. And the fact that we saw the same kind of pattern taking place in Rio around the same time, it's a bit of sensationalism and a bit of hysteria. Oh my God, there's corruption in the building of the Olympic venues, and oh my God, will they be ready in time? And oh my God, the plumbing doesn't work in the athletes' living quarters. So, that's the grist of international news these days, is looking for potential. You haven't seen the competition start. You're ginning up interest in the competition when it comes in. In the meantime, let's get everybody excited about what may be going wrong there. Now, what's happened since the Sochi Olympics was the fact that this widespread government-supported doping operation has been revealed, something that's virtually, in its scale, unprecedented, in Olympic history. And that's another thing that, like MH17, the Russian government has absolutely said, we're not going to talk about it. We're never going to admit that it happened. And because it happened on our territory, we're going to make sure that there's no way to ever get conclusive evidence about it. So it's the nature of the news media to look for failures and holes on the part of the authorities. And it's easy to find them both in the American government and in the Russian government, and I don't think we can fault the coverage of the Russian government very much by Western news media.
Gentlemen, all the way in the back.
Have you or your colleagues ever discussed what it is about Trump's Russian Jones, the fact that it can't help him with a larger American audience at a time when he needs help, but what's behind it? Is it the bling? Is it the gangster strut? Is it the Slavic beauties? What is it?
I think you've actually identified some things there. The gangster strut, maybe. The things that Trump has said suggest that he does admire Putin for his strongman stance. He has suggested that he sort of admires the ability to do things by fiat rather than by legislative processes. So I think that's something that's deeply attractive. The other thing is that although in truth Putin himself has been very careful not to endorse Trump directly, And in fact, the things that he's been quoted as saying, he said that he never actually said that he was a brilliant person. He was a bright person, or I suppose it could be translated as a vivid personality. But in fact, Putin's surrogates in Russia, Russian officials and politicians and analysts and academics have come out in many ways to be very favorable of Trump's campaign and done things that amounted to an endorsement of him. The American University in Moscow, which is supported by the Russian government, came out with a video that you can see on YouTube in which a number of their leading academics came out and said, Trump's the guy. I mean, you can say what you want about his personality and his history, but in terms of relations with Russia, he's the person that we genuinely believe is the person that Americans should support.
Back to FARA, you mentioned the Foreign Agents Registration Act earlier. Isn't it true that we have in America the same act since 1938, and the Russian one was almost word for word taken from the American FARA, Foreign Agents Registration Act? I think you should know this.
Yeah, it was taken from that.
It's in the laws in America since 1938 to combat Nazi propaganda in the United States. But it's still in the books. We have FARA, and the Russian Foreign Agents Registration Act is modeled word for word on the American one. So what is wrong with that?
Well, it may in fact be true. I can tell you that I don't know the historical background on this. So, but are we using our Alien Registration Act? Is an Alien Registration Act the same thing as a foreign agent label in a country where being a foreign agent is equivalent to being a traitor in the pay of some other government? Our Alien Registration Act made life difficult for immigrants to this country, and it may, for all I know, eventually be renewed if the political situation in this country changes. But I would argue that the way those things are being used today is nothing like the same.
I Googled it yesterday, and it's exactly to combat agents, Americans who are paid by foreign governments to do propaganda in this country. And this is exactly what the Russian FARA is about.
Yes. But is it being applied to people who are paid by foreign governments to do propaganda in Russia? Is Golis, for instance, the election monitoring organization, an agent of the United States that's being paid to do propaganda in Russia? I would argue no.
Or Memorial.
Memorial.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Notoriously. Other questions?
What's the word about Syria on the streets of Moscow?
Actually, you already had a chance. Let's find somebody else.
This is a follow-up about election. We get a lot of reportage about Russian interference with our democratic process. So I just wondered how valid or how people in Russia felt about it, or if you felt it was a valid report.
I have to say that most of what I know about the accusations of Russian organizations hacking American political organizations comes from the American side. And we've heard, I think, pretty persuasive arguments that in fact that hacking was done by Russian hacking organizations, which it would seem have connections to the Russian regime, would not be able to operate at that level without the acquiescence of the Russian regime. So what does that tell us? Does it mean that they're actually meddling in our election in a way that's designed to produce a certain result, namely to get Donald Trump elected, for instance? Or does it mean that this is an effort to just undermine confidence and trust in the American electoral system? either way, it would seem to be a win-win for anybody who was not a friend of American democracy.
We have time for a couple more questions. How about over there?
Hi, I have a question about your work as a journalist mostly, and the way that, well, my first question is, do you speak Russian?
Not well enough to.
Okay, because I remember you referencing something in Russian earlier, but in the story that we heard, you were using a translator. So I was wondering how you think that you're being a foreigner, but also not speaking the local language, had an impact on the way that you understood the politics that were going on there, and kind of like what you were missing out on based on things that you didn't have linguistic access to.
Yeah, I think that's a fair criticism. You know, if you are not a fluent Russian speaker, and if you are not well versed in Russian culture, you're at a great disadvantage. And I think, you know, it means that you need to be extremely careful in the kind of reporting that you do. You need to be extremely careful about who you work with and how your conversations with people are interpreted. You know, we try to do the best we can. My successor, I'm happy to say, the young man who'll be taking over as our Russian correspondent in Moscow, is a very fluent Russian speaker with 12 years of experience in the country. So I think that particular criticism will no longer be valid.
So since I'm a professor, I like to turn everything into a learning opportunity. So could you teach us about a moment when you particularly felt that there was some kind of cultural disconnect that was happening, that you either you felt that something wasn't reading or something wasn't happening, and you knew that the cultures were kind of coming at attention?
Yeah, I can actually think of one that took place right after the MH17 shoot down. We were traveling around that whole area. There were 3 big debris sites in that portion of eastern Ukraine where parts of this plane came down. And so a lot of people who lived in the small villages around there had been impacted by this. And so we went around and we interviewed a number of people there. And I was traveling with a reporter from The Independent, the UK newspaper. And he was a very meticulous guy named Andrew Buncombe. And he's still working for them. You can see his byline quite often. He was, as a broadcast reporter, I found his working style to be a little bit slow. He would talk to people for long periods of time in these places, and in seemingly circuitous ways where we sort of never really got any facts from them. And so we were having a conversation with a family that had had a big piece of debris fall in their garden. And in fact, the grandmother was sitting on the bench outside their little house at the time this thing came down, and by a miracle, she was not hurt. But the family's cat was killed. And so we had a long conversation with him, and he talked about, well, what did it feel like when this thing came down, and what did you see, and what did it look like when it laid there, and what did you imagine that it was when you first heard it and saw it? And, you know, we talked to these people for quite some time, and Andrew was asking questions as we were sort of alternating asking our questions. And finally he looks at them and he says, "And tell me, madam, what was the name of the cat?" And my other colleagues and I kind of rolled our eyes. And all at once, the grandmother, the babushka, begins to cry. Cat's name was Bilberry. And, you know, he got to the point about this thing that had deeply touched them. You know, their beloved pet was killed by this weird accident. And once we had allowed them to show that little bit of emotion over this pet, all of a sudden the story came tumbling out. And we really started to hear the emotional quality of it. But, you know, we wouldn't have gotten that from, you know, I mean, these are people who have the standard Russian cultural reserve when it comes to talking to strangers, you know. And had they not had the opportunity to make that connection, we would have never gotten the story from them that we did.
One more. I haven't picked from. Yes, young man.
I recall you said that you think a lot of people are really hiding their true feelings in polls regarding Putin. And at the risk of sounding like a conspiracy theorist, or perhaps getting the same answer that you already gave, with less than 30% voter turnout in Moscow and St. Petersburg in the parliamentary elections last month, and with the economy, like foreign reserves, rapidly depleting, with next year being the centenary of the revolution, do you think like there could be a 1989 Czechoslovakia moment?
No. No, I mean, in all fairness, no, I think not. I mean, I think the low turnout in the parliamentary election was meaningful in that it showed that people didn't see that there was much point in taking part in it. You know, I think the economic difficulties are very real. But as I say, Russia is a wealthy country, and Russians are a very tough and resilient people who are prepared to make big sacrifices and to endure very difficult conditions if they believe that, you know, this is something that's needed to protect the homeland. And I think, you know, there is also, you know, there's this tremendous propaganda grip on the minds and hearts of Russian people, and, you know, that they basically support the government. So no, I don't think there's going to be any major change in the foreseeable future.
So stay tuned. We have run out of time. I do want to remind everyone that the Center for Russian Culture is waiting to have a reception to which you are all warmly invited. People will be walking over. I don't think you'll miss the building. And I wanted to thank Corey for teaching us for the last few years.
Thank you all for coming.